our session 4 of Truth 2020 underway. I will be the moderator. I'm Joe Ulatowski. Co-organized this conference with colleagues Robert Barnard, Adam Podlakowski, Marcus Rosberg, and Chase Wren. Tonight's session is entitled Smoke and Flickering Shadows, Strawson and Evans on Truth and Factuality. It will be a panel discussion with Hugh Price, Cheryl Misak, Doug Edwards, and Amie Thomasson.
And thank you, well, first of all, to you and the other organizers for inviting me and for putting together such a wonderful meeting. As I said to you a moment ago before we started, it's a great pity for me that I can't join in the other sessions because I'm here in Australia and not capable of staying up after 11 p.m. at night. But I'm looking forward to watching the recordings. Today we're going to, first of all, we're going to watch a video from 1973, a discussion between P.F. Strawson and Gareth Evans about truth. And then with the other panelists, Cheryl and Doug and Amie, we're going to have a little discussion about that and then open up for Q&A at the end. The story of how I came to encounter the video in the first place is in the, I think it's in the material that Joe has distributed in announcing this session, and it's also at the little website that I've been running in the last couple of months with Richard Marshall on the 316 side, which is a series of commentaries about the discussion. More about that later. But now I'm going to hand you over to Strawson and Evans.
When a philosopher asks the question, what is truth, we need to know what would count as a satisfactory answer. The two philosophers you're now going to hear are looking for an answer which will do at least two things. First, it must show what all true statements have in common. The reason why we want to know this is because we want to explain why it is that we apply the same word, true, to many different kinds of statements. We want to show how all true statements resemble each other. But if we want to give a complete account of this, we also need to show how different kinds of true statement are related to each other. And this is the second thing that we demand of a satisfactory account of truth. We want to show both how true statements resemble each other and how they differ. Here now to discuss such an account of truth are P.F. Strawson of Magdalen College, Oxford, and Gareth Evans of University College, Oxford.
Well, some 50 years ago, as you know, of course, Frank Ramsay said that there was no serious problem about the general nature of truth, though, of course, there were problems about the nature of statement or assertion and the nature of belief. And I think in spite of all that's happened in the intervening time, I think Ramsay was right. The question, what it is for a statement to be true or a belief to be true, really admits of a simple answer, and the answer is this, that a statement is true if, and only if, things are as one who makes that statement thereby states them to be. And a belief is true if, and only if, things are as one who holds that belief thereby believes them to be. Now this rather trivial sounding formula has two great merits. For one thing, it admits of as many specific applications as you please. And again, on the other hand, it makes the point which Austin, I think, expressed by saying it takes two to make a truth. For example, suppose someone says or believes that Caesar was bald. Then what he says or what he believes is true if and only if Caesar was indeed bald. And here we have this twofold reference on the one hand to a believing or a saying, and on the other hand to that in the world which the statement is about or the belief is about. This is twofold reference to the thought on the one hand and the world on the other, and any adequate account of truth must allow for that. Now, as I said at the beginning, Ramsay did acknowledge that there were plenty of problems in the vicinity which weren't so simply dealt with, and one of these was the problem of the nature of assertion. And I suppose one might regard current investigations into systematic semantics as an attack on this problem. That's to say, this is an investigation into the nature of those linguistic conventions in virtue of mastery of which we're able to say and to understand the true or false things that we do say or understand. Now, what I regard as misleading is to call the outcome of these investigations a definition of truth, as is fashionably done. For example, if somebody comes up with systematic semantics for English, which nobody, of course, has in fact yet done, then it would be in this fashion to say that he's defined truth for English, or defined true in English. But of course, there isn't one concept of truth for English, another for French, another for Swahili, and so on. There's just truth. If the semantic theorist is to be said to have defined anything, then I think it would be better to say that he's defined English rather than he's defined truth.
Well, I think on their behalf, I would concede that. It seems to me that the concept of truth has an application across languages. It has a wider range of extension than any of the terms they define. I wonder, perhaps slightly parenthetically, I wonder whether one can't, however, get some illumination from their ideas, from a Taskian style treatment, by trying to identify grammatical categories which are common to many languages, such as name and predicate, conjunction, negation, and so on, and try and define truth recursively. Something along the following lines. One might say you take the basic set of sentences, which will be, let us say, names coupled with predicates, and we say that such a sentence of this kind is true if the item named by the name satisfies the predicate or the predicate applies to it. And then, for more complicated sentences, say a negation, a sentence which consists of another sentence with a negation sign, is true just in case that other sentence is not true, and so on with conjunction and the other devices of sentential composition. I mean, it must be said that such a general application of this idea relies upon a primitive notion of naming, as I used it, and of satisfaction of predicates. But don't you think it gives us some illumination?
Well, look, I think it's an improvement on the language relative notion of truth. But I still think that the concept of truth has a generality which transcends, which goes beyond this typology of statement forms just as much as it transcends differences of language. However, I think in my turn I might make a concessive move here and say that that title, Theory of Truth, might well be allowed to include under it this sort of investigation of general statement forms common to all languages and their relations. And I think this for two reasons. First of all, it seems clear that if it were not for language and the variety of statement forms that make up all languages, if it were not for language, truth really wouldn't amount to very much, and indeed nor would thought amount to very much. And the other reason, more frivolous one perhaps, is that after all we have this grand title, Theory of Truth, and it seems rather pity to confine it to the rather insubstantial Ramsayan formula.
Well, very well. Let's look at the possibility. We both agree we want a general account of truth. And let's look as if this Ramsay formula, that's to say the formula, he said something true just in case things are as he stated them to be, does in fact capture this. Now, it seems to me there is a thin interpretation of this formula, which does. We understand this idea of things being in the world as someone states them to be as a sort of general statement which we understand from many particular instances of the following form. He said that snow is white and snow is white. He said that grass is green and grass is green, i.e. we understand that so long as there is a filling that we can put he said that P and P, in that schema and to yield a truth, things are as he stated them to be. And that seems to me what I should call the thin interpretation of that formula, and it does seem to me that's utterly general. But there is a more substantial interpretation, which I can call the realist interpretation, which puts more weight upon the idea of things in the world being in thus and such a condition. And it seems that if we do put a weight on that, it might not have the generality. The formula might not have the generality that it ought to have.
Could you say a bit more what you have in mind?
Well, of course, this idea of things in the world being in thus and such a condition is not the most perspicuous of notions. I mean, is it, one might ask, perhaps the distribution of elementary particles and their organization and location and so on? But insofar as one has a grip upon the idea, it seems difficult to find things in the world which would make, say, mathematical statements true, or maybe some logical truths true. It seems that these moral statements too, the mathematical statements are difficult because it doesn't seem that there are things whose relations and dispositions make 2 and 2 plus 4 true. 2 and 2 plus 2 equals 4, true. And in the case of, say, a moral statement, John ought to look after his mother, it isn't that there's any lack of things. John and his mother are certainly there, but it's difficult to see in virtue of what relationship, if one takes a realistic idea of this, in virtue of what relation they must stand for the statement to be true.
Well, 2 things here. First, you raised the question about the condition of things in the world, or facts about the world, just how extensive is this, and you mentioned the relation of elementary particles. Well, I think we can construe it a little, indeed a great deal more broadly than that. I think it might be allowed to cover facts about the disposition and relation of gross bodies, of ordinary physical bodies, facts about their sensible qualities. We have facts about people's states of mind. We have facts about social institutions and the rules that are accepted in them or that constitute them, and the degree to which people's behavior represents compliance with these rules and failure to comply with them. We really have an enormous range of types of fact which fairly clearly fall under the rubric facts about the world, or statements or descriptions of how things are in the world, this crucial phrase. However, I must concede that though we can make this a very extensive range of facts, it's not so easy to include in it mathematical facts, as we approach to call them, or the facts, if that's the right word, expressed by moral judgments. But isn't it worth remarking that philosophers, precisely sensitive to the importance in this connection of the notion of condition of things in the world, or facts about the world, have been prone to reclassify mathematical formulae and moral judgments, to refrain from calling them statements in the strict sense, true or false in the strict sense, have been inclined to reclassify them, to count, say, moral judgments, to assimilate them to imperatives, as Professor Hare notably does, and to treat mathematical formulae, logical truths perhaps, with rules, to assimilate those to rules.
Yes, but their propensity to do this illustrates, it seems to me, the power of this connection, the connection between truth and things in the world having to be in such and such a condition. But I mean, this does seem to me an unacceptable consequence, that we deprive these of appropriate bearers of truth and falsity, and they're not statements. And I mean, I do put it as a virtue of this very thin interpretation of the Ramsay formula that each of these fit. I mean, he said that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and 2 plus 2 does indeed equal 4.
Well, now, how about this? Couldn't one say that truth in the primary sense is as conceived in the realist interpretation, the one which puts the weight it does put on facts about the world, the way things are in the world. This is truth in the primary sense. One who says something true in this sense says how things are in the world, and what he says is true because things are in the world as he says they are. But what we do, and intelligibly do, is to extend the word true, the notion of truth, and apply it to other utterances which play a different role in our lives from that of stating or purporting to state how things are in the world. And we do this because the acceptability of those utterances depends on the truth of other things which are true in the primary sense. So there's a kind of dependence of things which we call true in this extended sense on truth in the primary sense.
Well, I see the program, I see the idea of this extension, but you'll have to refine it, won't you? Because there are a large range of things which we judge to be acceptable on the basis of truths in the primary sense, which I don't think even you would want to call true, such things as giving of advice and commands. I mean, these we do evaluate in the way you suggest.
Yeah, that's quite right, of course, and so I put it wrongly or insufficiently clearly. Let me try again. Let's take a mathematical formula, a simple one like 7 plus 5 equals 12. It's quite clear that this doesn't state how things are in the world. More specifically, it doesn't state what the results are of certain sorts of counting operations. For example, you might count one group of sheep, then another group of sheep separately, and then count all of the sheep together, and if you do so, you will characteristically come up with a certain result. Now, it's certainly true that 7 plus 5 equals 12 doesn't state what this result is, but the fact is that counting operations of this sort, not just on sheep, but on millions of types of things, do regularly and characteristically have a certain outcome. This is a fact about the world, right? And because of this fact about the world, the mathematical formulae and formulae of that sort have a certain utility for us, which they wouldn't have if these facts didn't hold. They enable us perhaps to calculate how many sheep there are in a certain field. They enable us to get from one set of truths about the world to another set of truths about the world. And in this way they enter into, are entwined with other elements in our total belief system. I mean, arithmetic, simple arithmetic, cannot by itself tell me how much money I have in my bank account, but it can certainly help to work out how much money I've got in my bank account.
Simple arithmetic may be, I can see that this account might work for it, but mathematics can get quite refined. We have propositions about the irrational numbers, about non-denumerable infinities, and say in pure logic we have propositions such as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It's very difficult to see how quite these can be regarded as intertwined in that way.
Okay, so one has to admit that mathematics develops a sort of autonomy, that it develops its own criteria of acceptability, its own procedures of proof, and so forth. But this doesn't show that the links that I want to emphasize are severed. The links are still there. They're just less direct in cases like this. Of course, there's no very straightforward application of highly sophisticated mathematics to the way things are in the world, in the way I illustrated in the case of a simple arithmetical formula. But though the links are less direct, the links are still there.
Well, I agree again that there are these differences. I can see the difference between different demarcations to be made between fact-stating discourse in some primitive and prior sense and the mathematical discoveries. And not only do I see that these would be distinguished, I can see an order of development. I can see the order indeed you see. But it doesn't seem to me that the account of truth, the theory of truth, is the place to reflect these differences. It seems to me that that we want an undifferentiated concept. You remember you wanted, and you charged Tarski and others, systematic semanticists, you wanted an undifferentiated concept of truth which applied, on the one hand, across languages, and within a language, across different statement forms. Well, I want an undifferentiated notion of truth which applies across different statement contents.
I see, but notice what happens, or what can happen, when somebody is devoted to your undifferentiated concept of truth. For example, instead of being prepared to accept my primary truth and secondary extensions, for example, in mathematics, what typically happens for somebody wedded to the notion of undifferentiated truth is that he, as it were, extends his notion of the world to keep pace with the undifferentiated notion of truth. Thus, he tends to invent or imagine a realm of timeless, perfect, mutable mathematical objects, the relations between which are reflected or mirrored in the truths of mathematics. What you get is, in fact, Platonism in mathematics, an extension of the world to run along with mathematical truth. And indeed, you get the same sort of thing, though we haven't talked about this in morality.
You mean the sort of non-natural qualities that Moore talks about?
Non-natural qualities, exactly.
Yes. But of course, the undifferentiated notion of truth leads to these excesses, and I agree with you that they are excesses only if it's a realist one. It seems to me that's one of the great merits of the thin interpretation that I've given of the Ramsay formula, that we can have an undifferentiated notion of truth which doesn't have this consequence. We don't need objects and whose states and relations are true in virtue of.
Ah, I see. You wish to cling to the undifferentiated version of truth, but reject any extensions of the realist picture that goes along with it. Yes. Well, now let's see. There are two things, it seems to me, that we can agree about. First of all, we can agree about the coverage of the expression true and of the notion of truth. That's to say, we can agree the word is used and correctly used, not only of the honest to goodness empirical truths which reflect the way things are in the world, but it also has this further extension to cover mathematics, moral judgments, logic, and so forth. That we can agree on. And it seems to me there's something else that we ought, at any rate, to agree on, namely that this extensive coverage of the notion of truth is something that calls for explanation. Now, it seems to me that the notion I've sketched at least provides the pattern of an explanation. That's to say, the notion of primary truth, which is a matter of reflecting the way things are in the world, and then an explanation on the basis of this of how we come to extend the notion into these other fields. Here is, well, not a full explanation, but at least the pattern, the project of an explanation, but it doesn't seem to me that you have offered one.
No, I haven't, and I'm not in a position to do so. That's to say, the demarcation of the class of truth-bearing utterances, or truth or falsity-bearing utterances. I offer this just tentatively. I mean, we do the formula itself. He said that P and P does impose a certain grammatical restriction, doesn't it? I mean, we can't get. He said that close the door and close the door.
Right.
So I mean, that's going to do some of the work for us.
Well, yes, but the work which this grammatical test does is a work of demarcation and not a work of explanation. Incidentally, it doesn't even do the demarcation quite right, because there are typically constructions like the future indicative in English, for example, which would pass your grammatical test in that sentences in this tense and mood fit in, but sentences in this tense and mood are often used for giving of orders, for example.
What?
Well, you find this in the army orders, company orders. A company will parade at 10:30 tomorrow morning. This isn't something up for assessment as true or false.
It's not true if they do. No.
Well, as on the board there, it's an order, not a prediction. So the grammatical test, for one thing, doesn't demarcate quite right. That seems to be trivial. More important is the point that at best you get a demarcation of the class of things that are true or false, and not an explanation of the extension of the coverage, the range of that class.
Well, the only deeper suggestion I can make, I can see that. I mean, in a way, one could put the point also by saying how difficult it would be to identify the appropriate grammatical forms in a totally alien language. For example, one would have to look at it.
Right.
Yes, the only suggestion I can make is, and it's a gesture in the direction of belief. The idea, that's to say, that anything appropriately regarded as true or false is a proper object of belief, and indeed this might be used to distinguish assertions in a complicated way from command.
Right. Well, I think that's better in that it's not something purely formal, purely grammatical. The idea is that the things which are true or false are proper objects of belief. My worry here is whether the obscurity which surrounds the notion of the coverage of true or false doesn't extend also to the notion of the coverage of belief. And I think the current tendency to associate belief with action would not yield you an answer here. But what would yield you an answer, and probably is something we haven't time to discuss.
Next, we're going to have our panel discussion. Each of us on the panel will speak for 5 minutes or so, and we'll have a discussion amongst the four of us, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So first of all, we have Cheryl. Cheryl, welcome to our panel.
Thank you. So this is an absolute gem of a conversation, and it opens with Susan Wilson asking how we can apply the concept of truth to so many different kinds of statements. And then Peter Strawson immediately opens with an idea that Frank Ramsay had now 100 years ago, not 50 years ago, as he says, because this idea was first written down by him in 1921 when he was an 18-year-old undergraduate in a paper called The Nature of Propositions. And in that paper, Ramsay says, as Strawson noted, that P is true and P are equivalent. And later on, he says this is a truism, but there is no platitude so obvious that eminent philosophers have not denied it. And he had in mind, I think, McTaggart and William James. Now, this truism has made a lot of philosophers think that Ramsay was a founder of the redundancy theory, on which the concept of truth is superfluous and can be eliminated. But Strawson doesn't make this mistake. Strawson immediately says that Ramsay went on to say that there were more substantial problems in the vicinity. So Ramsay went on to say that all the hard work was still to come after you had articulated the truism. And the hard work is to say what it is to believe that P, or to assert that P. Now, that early 1921 paper was an attack by this 18-year-old undergraduate on Russell's conception of a proposition as an entity that, if true, stands in a correspondence relationship to objects in the world. And Ramsay said in this 1921 paper, even in the simplest case, this relation is so complicated, and in the case of a general proposition, it is infinitely complex. And that's because in a general proposition, such as all humans are mortal, we have an infinite number of humans to relate to the proposition, past, present, and future. In 1929, so Ramsay's a little bit more grown up now, he's still worried about this problem of open, universal generalizations. And this time it was in the context of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, which Ramsay had translated as an undergraduate. And he thinks that Wittgenstein faces the same problem as Russell. You can't express an open generalization in a primary language that is hooked up to objects in the world. And it is in this context that we get Ramsay's wonderful quip. What we can't say, and we can't whistle it either. So if you really can't express an open generalization in your primary language, which hooks onto objects in the world, you're in trouble. Now, what was Ramsay's alternative account when he started to do all that hard work? Well, he argued that a belief, and that's what's relevant when it comes to truth, not a proposition or an independently existing entity. Ramsay said that that's such a mysterious, like, what are these mysterious entities? I've never encountered one. So what we're looking at when we ask about truth is a belief or an assertion, and Ramsay characterized a belief or an assertion as a habit or a rule with which we meet the future. And he takes this right out of the founder of pragmatism, C.S. Peirce, and Ramsay is expressly putting forward a pragmatist account. I'm not sure of truth, but a pragmatist account. We can get to that later. So a belief is a habit, and these habits are assessed in terms of whether or not they're successful, in terms of whether or not they allow us to meet the future in a good way. So an open generalization, he says, is an inference we are at any time prepared to make. It is a rule for judging. So every time I encounter a human, I just have a rule, mortal, and this will affect the way I act. If I want these humans to live, I'll be careful driving my car around them. I won't take myself to be an exception to the rule, et cetera, and reassess the rule depending on how well it allows us to meet the future. Now, Ramsay also thought that this account of belief or assertion could give us good accounts of counterfactual conditionals, of inductive conclusions, of partial beliefs, famously. And he started, just before he died, to tinker with whether this account of belief could give us a good understanding of ethical judgments and maybe even aesthetic judgments. But he died in 1930 at the age of 26 in the middle of writing this book. So Ramsay thought that there was a certain pragmatist account of truth that could answer Wilson's question of how we apply the same concept to all these very different kinds of statements. And he argued throughout his life against the metaphysical or ontological account of truth that he found in Russell and then in Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And he summarized his approach in what I think is a very nice way. He said that we mustn't look for a realist account of truth, but a realistic account of truth. So an account of truth that was realistic in that it was, it captured our practices, not some theoretical construction, which is what he sometimes called Wittgenstein's Tractatus and Carnap's Aufbau. So I think Strawson was right to employ Ramsay's truism, and then I think actually Strawson took that truism to a place that Ramsay himself would have been very happy to end up in.
Thank you, Cheryl. I didn't quite catch, you say that Strawson took it to a place that Ramsay would not have been happy to end up?
No, that I think he would have been quite happy to, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Doug, next.
Thanks very much. Thanks, and thanks for organizing this and for inviting me to be on it, and also for preserving this wonderful video. It's actually the first time I think I've seen Gareth Evans talking philosophy, so it's a really awesome thing to have. So yeah, I wanted to kind of start by talking a bit about the constraints that Susan Wilson gives us on a theory of truth at the beginning, right? These ideas of unity and diversity, that a theory of truth needs to explain how truth is unified and that there's something that all truths have in common, yet also diverse in that we can apply the same word true to statements of many different kinds. And some of the examples talked about in the video include, empirical, mathematical, logical, moral, social statements. And it seems that, it's a kind of an interesting thing to think about when thinking about truth, is how to kind of combine these two very different things. Like, how can truth be one thing and also kind of be applied to so many different things? And it seemed to me that Strawson and Evans, in the discussion each give different answers to this question, which kind of, they give us an interesting discussion about the pros and cons of each view. Strawson seems to favor, as in his own terms and times, this kind of more kind of realist approach where there's a dependence of what's true on the ways the world is, or facts in the world. Whereas Evans seems to give us what he calls a thin, and what we might nowadays call a kind of more deflationary approach to truth, where, there isn't really, we can say pretty much all we need to say about truth by talking about, somebody says something true just in case they said the P and P, and you can plug in any sort of statement that you want in the P position there. They're both trying to capture, it seems, these elements of unity and diversity. And in the discussion, it seems that they both kind of encountered problems, right? Strawson's realist position, right, even when he's kind of pushed by Evans to amend it to this thought that we take empirical truth to be the primary truth, and then mathematical, moral, logical truths to be kind of derived from those. As Evans pushes him on it, it seems difficult to encompass the diversity of all the different kinds of truths on that model. Right? It seems that we're kind of hamstrung by this commitment to empirical truth being the central thing. So we have trouble accounting for diversity. Evans's view seems, at least according to Strawson, to be kind of too weak to capture the unity kind of thought, that the basic principle that Evans gives us is not substantial enough to satisfactorily demarcate the class of things that we want to say are true or false. So I was kind of interested, in light of this, in something that Evans says towards the end of the discussion when they're talking about this diversity issue. And he says, I think this is about what he says. He says, it doesn't seem to me that the theory of truth is the place to reflect these differences. That when we're talking about differences between empirical, moral, mathematical, logical, social statements, that the theory of truth is not the place to reflect those differences. And I was kind of wondering whether, I kind of wanted to think about that, because it seems that there are other theories available which do use truth to kind of account for these differences, which can also provide different answers, a different answer to how we account for unity and diversity. So, Cheryl already talked about one alternative to the views on the table, this kind of pragmatist idea, but I kind of wanted to kind of just, bring pluralism about truth into the discussion, where the thought here is that, we take the realist thought that Strawson has fairly seriously, that there's something significant about empirical truths being true because of ways that the world is. But we don't try to overreach with that, right? We don't try to take that places it's not supposed to go into, say, mathematics and ethics. But we don't give up on those kinds of claims being true. We don't give up on giving an account of proper, substantive account of truth for those claims, like we might think Evans perhaps does, because we think that, well, we need to understand the way that statements in those domains, we need to think about the way that they're true in a different way from the empirical case. So, we've already got a commitment to the idea that there are different kinds of statements in different sorts of subject matters. So perhaps we should think that they're true in different ways and use a theory of truth to reflect those differences. That's one way to capture the diversity thought, right? That explains why there's truth, the word true can be applied to all these different things, because all these statements are true in different kinds of ways, depending on the sorts of activities we take these statements to be involved in. Of course, you still have the unity problem, right? How do you unify all these different ways of being true together? And, Cheryl mentioned notions like assertion and belief, and I think, there's various ways to do this. One is to think, well, look, like the aim of a belief or an assertion is to be true. They're all aiming at the same thing, but they just get to be true in different ways, right? A moral statement might get to be true in a different way from a mathematical one, just like, when you're playing a competitive game, you're always trying to win. There's one thing you're trying to do, but what you have to do to win changes depending on the game that you're playing, right? What you have to do to win a game of chess is different from what you have to do to win a game of tennis, but you're still trying to do the same thing. So I think, you know, there's different ways to try to capture these unity and diversity thoughts about truth. And I guess, I was really kind of interested in thinking about whether the theory of truth is the place to reflect that. And if it isn't, you know, yeah, where else we might do that. But yeah, I really loved the video. I think it's wonderful.
Thank you very much, Doug. And I will come back to some of those issues you've raised in the discussion. So next we have Amie Thomasson. Welcome, Amie.
Yeah, the video is so striking because there's this sort of contrast between the antiquated format and the completely contemporary discussion of ideas. So Susan Wilson, as we saw, begins by asking what we're looking for in a theory of truth, and suggesting that what we want is to say what all true statements have in common. And that, of course, when you first hear it, sounds innocent enough, but it does seem to have a certain presupposition that truth is a predicate that names a quality shared by all true statements, and our task is to investigate it. In my view, we do better if we step back, take a page out of Hugh's book, and take a side-on view here, and start not by assuming that truth is a predicate that has this kind of function of naming some sort of feature that we're going to investigate, but asking what functions truth ascriptions or a truth predicate serve in our language, and what rules it follows. Well, why is this important? So Strawson, in a bit of the movie that I love, says, oh, it's rather a pity that we have this grand name theory of truth, that we would just confine it to the sort of trivial observation of Ramsay, right? And trying to get a more sort of substantial theory of truth to fit the grand title, he begins with this thought that truth requires both a saying and a world to make a truth. Then quickly encountering the problem of finding what in the world is making our moral and mathematical statements true, he shifts to trying out this kind of two-tiered view, trying to explain in virtue of what the statements in the primary sense are true, by appeal to the world being thus and so in some sense, and then to explain the truth of the sentences that are true in an extended sense, the mathematical and the moral, in terms of how, by showing how their truth depends on the truth of those things that are true in the primary sense. But this is a really hazardous route to take, as Strawson seems to be aware of, interestingly, right? I mean, if we really said something like that mathematical truths depend on truths about what results we get from our counting operations, we get the wrong truth conditions for our mathematical claims, right? Notoriously, we'd have to allow, for example, that 5 + 7 = 12 isn't eternally in mind independently true, but is true only once or given that people have counted in this way and achieve that result. And the same would go for moral or modal truths. So that kind of route where you're trying to explain the truth of truths in the extended sense in terms of truths in the primary sense is, I think, a very hazardous one. And I think we might do better by stepping back a step and asking what functions truth ascriptions or a truth predicate serve for us and what rules they follow. And of course, there's a variety of plausible functions that have been widely discussed in the literature, that the predicate enables us to endorse the assertions of others, even in situations where we're unwilling or unable to repeat the content, that it serves as a device of generalization, that, as Hugh has it, it engenders a kind of useful friction, putting pressure on us to rectify differing views in a way that's quite useful. What rules does the truth predicate follow that enables it to fulfill some of these functions? Well, at least we can start from the standard one, right, that we're always entitled to infer from P to its true that P, and vice versa. And that rule, as Evans notes, can be applied to statements with different contents in all sorts of different arenas. So this sort of shared functions and rules of use would seem to give us something like this kind of a way of fleshing out this undifferentiated notion of truth that Evans is after, at least in parts of this video, and that applies whether we're ascribing truth to ordinary empirical claims, moral claims, mathematical claims, whatever. Why not just go that way? Well, Strawson has this worry, right? He raised this worry towards the end, that typically what happens is that the philosopher extends his notion of the world to keep pace with this notion of truth and posits this realm of Platonistic mathematical objects or moral facts. Now, Evans starts out right on track, I think, and respond to this, saying, sure, some people take this route, but we don't have to go there with them in taking this kind of thin conception of truth. We don't have to think of these as objects in virtue of which the statements are true and have this direction of explanation, right? Now, on that basis, Strawson characterizes Evans as wishing to, here's the quote, cling to the undifferentiated version of truth, but reject any extensions of the realist picture that goes along with it. And Evans agrees. Now, that's the point where I wish I could step into the room. Because on my view, the right move here is not to reject the view that there are numbers, possibilities, moral facts, properties, and so on. Instead, I think the right approach is to generalize this sort of side-on view that begins by asking what the functions are of our mathematical, moral, modal, and so on talk, and by what rules we become entitled to refer to numbers, moral facts, and so on, and not just assuming that these function like terms for apples or chipmunks to track certain entities in our world that may serve a kind of explanatory purpose. If we take something like that sort of more complete pragmatist route, then I think we can allow not only that there are many moral, mathematical, and modal claims that are true, and that's of course one of the points that Evans wanted to insist to not give up, right? But also allow that there are wrong actions, prime numbers, possible solutions to the housing crisis, and so on. What we reject is the assumption that all of these terms function in the same way as nouns and predicates that are introduced to track features and objects in the world. Then if somebody still wants to insist that in talking about truth, we must say what all true statements have in common, we're also entitled to give a suitably minimalist answer to that. What they have in common is just the property of being true, or as Stephen Colbert put it, truthiness.
Now, just a few comments from me before we move over to panel discussion and then Q&A. I found the exchange between Strawson and Evans that we've just watched. I found it nearly 40 years ago when I was a postdoc at ANU in Canberra and happened to come across a reference to it in the subject catalogue in the library when I was looking for more things to read about truth. And I screened it then and have come back to it every few years since. And apart from its what you might call its kind of sociological charms, the fact that it's a piece of Oxford at a particular period, and those, at least from my perspective, those charms have only increased with age, the age of the video and the age of myself, as I come back to it over all those decades. But also its content has remained at least as relevant to me. And one of the things I'm struck by when I come back to it is, I mean, each time I have the sense that I to some extent had forgotten just how relevant it is. I'm not able to unpick to what extent I was influenced by it, but I'm sure I must have been. And the thing that most centrally has been interesting to me in this exchange is this question that Strawson and Evans come to about halfway through, about the link between truth and the problem of distinguishing between the sort of primary and secondary uses of statements, or between genuinely factual claims and things in their examples, such as mathematics or moral claims. And I think that Strawson and Evans are right to think that you can't draw that distinction out of Ramsay's thin notion of truth. At the end, they mention the question as to how else you might draw the distinction. Evans suggests that we might appeal to the idea of belief and say that genuinely factual claims are the ones that express genuine beliefs. And Strawson suggests that the same sort of difficulties about sort of minimalism belief will lead to exactly the same sorts of issues that they've been discussing about truth. And I think he's right, at least in one sense. But the question is, where does that leave us? And my own view is, and has been for a long time, that we should say that the question they're looking for an answer to, this question of the distinction between the genuinely factual and the non-factual or less factual claims, is misconceived, that there just isn't any kind of sharp bifurcation of that kind in language. There is, in my view, a kind of gradation in the sense that we treat some topics as more a matter for serious disagreement than others, but it's not any kind of sharp line. On the other hand, I think that there is a sense in which recognizing that does involve truth in a way that some versions of the kind of deflationary views of truth that we have these days, developed among other people by Paul Horridge, who I see we have on the call here. Hello, Paul. Nice to see you. I think that there's an element that some of those views have missed, that we need to put into the mix when we're talking about truth, and which is related to this, its role in disagreements. So my view is that truth, and Amie has alluded to this, truth plays a crucial role as a norm that makes disagreements matter to us. In fact, my own view is that that's one of the most interesting things to say about truth, and that it's something that the sort of thin views descended to from Ramsay can easily miss. Now, I'm not suggesting that Ramsay himself would have missed this. In fact, there are indications in some of his very late pieces that he's right onto it, because he's onto the question as to why we disagree about things such as rules for judging. But noticing this this fact about truth, that it's linked to our disagreement behavior in this way, in a sort of normative way, that's not a contribution to saying what truth is in the normal sense. It's not an answer to the metaphysical question, what is truth? It's an answer to a different question. Questions such as, why do creatures like us have a use for such a notion in our linguistic practices? What role does it play in our lives? These are clearly pragmatist questions in some sense. But they're not the point I want to make is that they're not metaphysical questions. We're not asking about the nature of truth. Deflationists are also approaching truth in this sense, and so they're asking about the sort of logical role of the truth predicate in language and things of that kind. As people like Paul have stressed, that's not telling us something about the nature of truth, it's telling us something about what it does for us. Now, this kind of shift from metaphysical questions to what we might call pragmatic or anthropological questions isn't really on the table in the Strawson and Evans discussion, though, as I said, it was certainly on the table for Ramsay, and perhaps increasingly so in his very late in his life. And so part of the poignancy of this discussion, from my point of view, comes from the sense that it might have been on the table if the conversation had continued a bit longer, or if Ramsay had had the opportunity to develop his ideas further, in which case it would certainly have been a very different conversation. And people in Oxford in the 1970s would have been talking about truth in very different ways, I think, if Ramsay's pragmatism had sort of flowered and influenced philosophy in the way that it clearly had the potential to do. So that's all I have to say. Now let's move over to a discussion. And what I would like to suggest is that we might pick up on the point that Doug mentioned about pluralism about truth, thinking of truth as being in some sense different in the different kinds of cases, mathematics, sort of empirical statements, and so on. And so I was wondering if I could ask Cheryl and Amie to say something about how that suggestion strikes you.
Good. I'm happy to leap in. And actually, what I want to say first is that I thought I was hearing right at the end of that discussion, Strawson's willingness to blur that distinction between fact and the extensions. So Ramsay would have only ended up where Strawson ended up, if I'm right, that Strawson was kind of seeing that his distinction might not hold as much water as he thought initially. So I think that the kind of pragmatist that Ramsay was, and I think that's the right kind of pragmatist to be, would be really quite happy with Doug's suggestion that there are different kinds of truths, although it doesn't make much difference if you put it that way. There are different kinds of truths, or the way I think Ramsay would probably put it, there are different kinds of ways in which statements show themselves to be true. There are different kinds of ways in which different statements are good habits with which to meet the future. So, a counterfactual conditional is going to be one kind of habit, a singular judgment is going to be a different kind of habit, an ethical judgment is going to have a very different way of showing itself to stand up to the way things are. So I think this kind of pragmatist ought to be happy enough with Doug's suggestion. She might want to phrase it slightly differently, though.
Amie.
Yeah, good. This is another point that I kind of wanted to speak about and didn't have time, because I have a huge amount of sympathy for Evans when he jumps in response to Strawson and says, I can see the order of development here, but I don't think the theory of truth is the place to make the distinction. So one thing I've just been sort of thinking about lately and starting to read is this sort of work on systemic functional linguistics, where you can sort of start to get a story from this branch of linguistics about how, say, mathematical and moral and modal discourse get introduced to the language, and the way in which they get introduced on the back of more basic talk, sort of straightforward, ordinary, empirical, observational talk, and how that's what's basic developmentally for individuals and sort of genetically for languages. Then we have very different rules that enable us to introduce terms for numbers and for ought and for rights and so on. So I was interested in thinking about that, and this is really just something I'm beginning to think about as a way of fleshing out the idea that, yeah, there's a difference here in development, but the difference should really be found in terms of the functions and introduction rules for things like these kinds of discourse that Strawson and Evans are finding problematic, the moral, the mathematical, the modal. And what we need is a more full-blown picture of the different functions these serve than the observational discourse that we begin with as toddlers, right? And the introduction rules for them. And these rules then will also be, I think, what entitles us to assertions that there's a chipmunk in the garden or that there is a prime number between 1 and 10, right? There'll be very different rules. And that's, I think, where we'll have the different rules that entitle us to make mathematical assertions versus empirical assertions. But I don't think if we stick with something like the thin, undifferentiated notion of truth, we have to say that there's a different kind of truth there. I mean, maybe there's a harmless way we can say that, but it can also be misleading into thinking of this as if there's two different kinds of chipmunk or something like that.
Doug, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, so I think it's, the more I'm thinking about it, it's just a question of how to, I agree with very much a lot of what's been said. And I think, with what Amie just said about the functions to rules to assertions and rules that entitle us to make assertions, there's part of me that finds it hard to resist the thought that, the rules that entitle us to make the assertions are kind of connected to truth for those sorts of assertions. So there's different functions that different expressions or kinds of statements might have. There's different rules that govern them according to what kind they are. And there's good and bad ways to follow those rules. There's standards of correctness. And I guess maybe it's just, to my ear, it's hard to resist the temptation then to say, well, then there's a different standard of truth or a different way that assertions are true there. But I agree that you don't So, I mean, but stepping back from that, I thought, so maybe your thought is, well, we don't want to kind of put truth into the picture there. We want to talk about rules and assertions and rules that license assertions, but stop short of saying that that really gives us an account of what truth is in that, for that kind of statement, because we want a more thin general notion of truth. And I think, I don't know if it's just, I guess, yeah, I think that seems to be a key issue, really. I think, even though I think it seems that we agree on a lot of stuff, that it's the question of where to put truth. Do we keep it separate from everything, or do we include it as part of the practice that we're talking about? So I think that's maybe the question that I would kind of be interested in thinking.
Yeah. One of the questions is what our question about truth is. And this is something I said in my own remarks. And my own feeling about the kind of pluralism about truth that you mentioned, Doug, is that it may be, to my ears, a little bit too inclined to be still asking what is truth and then expecting different answers in different cases, rather than just leaving that question entirely to one side and thinking in asking what I call the pragmatic or anthropological question: why do we have this? Why do we have this term? What role does this notion play in our lives, and especially our linguistic lives? And then if we frame things in that way, the question is whether there's anything left for the idea that there's some sort of plurality in our answers to that question across these different cases, or whether all of the differences between the different cases are picked up elsewhere, as I think Amie was suggesting, in terms of the different kinds of language entry and exit rules and things that we have operating in those different cases. So my inclination is to, I think, to be on the same side as what I take Amie's side to be here, that thinking that it's those other sorts of things which are doing the work of telling us the differences between these domains. And that the story about the functions of truth is largely a unitary one. Cheryl.
So my small worry, maybe it's a big worry, about the idea of characterizing truth in terms of language entry and exit rules, and that's that one would have to be careful that one wasn't one of those philosophers denying Ramsay's platitude or truism, right? So, so one can imagine being inculcated, doesn't have to stretch one's imagination very far, inculcated into a religion where there are very clear rules for assertion. And Ramsay has a nice example in this unfinished book manuscript that he was writing when he died. He says, so the belief in hell is, to have the belief in hell is, as the pragmatist says, to have a certain habit of action. So let's say I bring my children up to believe in hell, I go out on the street, I proselytize, I really try to convince you, Hugh, to believe in hell because I care about you, I don't want you to burn in it, and so on and so on. And Ramsay says, that's excellent, that's the pragmatist account of what it is to believe in hell, to have the belief. It's an account of the content of the belief. And then he says, but the belief in hell is true only if there is such a place. Otherwise, it is a mere waste of opportunities for enjoyment. So in other words, the matter of truth is pulled apart from the rules of how to use the term, and even what you will act upon. And I think that one has to be careful if you're going to have an account of that is about language entry and exit rules, to make sure that I think you want to hold on to the truism.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So I'm just curious about the kind of so it seems that Ramsay's principle there involves a certain regulation that is placed upon belief. So the truth of a belief seems to depend on something. So I'm wondering if that's kind of more like the Strawson idea that, you know, that there's something, the heavy connection between what's true and the world, which is a more kind of substantial reading of the principle than the kind of deflationary one. Is that right?
This is the biggest, hardest question for this kind of pragmatist. And this kind of pragmatist includes the founder of the tradition, C.S. Peirce. It includes Ramsay. It includes David Wiggins. It includes me. We want to have some touchstone to what Ramsay calls facts. But remember, he objected to Wittgenstein's account of facts, and he objects to the idea that a proposition can be broken down and its parts corresponding to the parts of facts, right? So he rejects all of that. He rejects that realist view, but he still wants this touchstone to the way things are. And this kind of pragmatist is also going to say, with respect to mathematics, that your belief that 7 + 5 equals 12 has better be connected to the facts, and your belief that the sexual assault of children is wrong is connected to its being wrong to sexually assault children. Now, how we unpack that is the big ugly question for this kind of pragmatism. But certainly this kind of pragmatist wants to hold on to some, as Ramsay called it, vague conception of fact. Otherwise, you lose the truism and you get the kind of Jamesian pragmatism that Ramsay, I think rightly, didn't want to have anything to do with.
I think one of the interesting questions there, Cheryl, is whether, in fact, to hang on to that notion of fact, you do need a notion of truth which is anything more than simply a discretational, a deflationary notion. And I remember there was a debate I think it was in the 80s, about whether truth had an explanatory role to play in accounting for behavioral success and things of that kind, whether we had to refer to the fact that people's beliefs were true in order to enable their success in getting around the world. It's a long time since I thought about that stuff, but certainly my own view at the time, and I think I argued this in Facts and the Function of Truth, was that all of that could be done effectively with the Ramsay formula in its most deflationary version. What's important for success is you believe that P, only if P, roughly speaking. And now, to generalize that, of course, and that's where the logical role of the truth predicate comes in. And so it's very helpful to have truth in that sense to help you to say what you want to say. But it's not doing any substantial work in the explanation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, discussants. It's fantastic.